The sun bled across the horizon in strokes of crimson and gold, the kind of light that could make a dying town look half alive. Elias Carter rode into it slow, his horse's ribs showing through its hide, dust clinging to both man and beast as though they were carved from the same clay. He carried no luggage but the revolver at his hip, the battered hat shading his eyes, and the long, unshakable weight of failure pressing on his shoulders. Every hoofbeat felt like a reminder: his land was gone, his wife was buried, and his pride had withered into hunger. The town seemed suspicious of strangers, the way border towns always did. A boy playing with a stick froze to watch him. A shopkeeper paused in her sweeping. Elias ignored their stares and tied his horse outside the only place that promised warmth, the saloon. He pushed through the swinging doors, air heavy with stale whiskey and smoke. The piano in the corner wheezed to silence. Inside, men played cards, women leaned against railings with painted smiles, and a bartender polished a glass that had long since lost its shine. The quiet stretched, but Elias had grown used to being the stranger, the drifter. He kept his eyes down, shoulders squared, and walked to the counter. "Whiskey," he said, voice dry as the desert itself. Coins clinked onto the wood. The bartender eyed them as though they were counterfeit, but finally poured. Elias took the glass and let the burn travel through him, dulling the ache of hunger more than quenching thirst. It was then the saloon doors groaned again, and silence returned as if the entire room had inhaled at once. A shadow filled the doorway, tall, broad, unshakable. She stepped in with boots that struck the boards like hammers. She wore no paint, no silks. Her dress was plain but fitted to a frame that looked more suited to war than widowhood. Her hair, black as ravens, was braided tight, and her jaw carried a hardness no man in that room would test. Whispers scurried through the saloon. "Boone's widow," someone muttered. Another spat the words like a curse. "She's back again." The woman strode to Elias without hesitation, as though she'd been following his trail all along. She stopped at his shoulder, the air tightening around him. He looked up, and for the first time in weeks, he felt small. "You," she said. Her voice was steady, a low rumble that carried authority born from fire and blood. "You need food. You need work. You need purpose." She leaned closer, her eyes glinting like steel catching firelight. "And I need a husband. You need a strong daughter. We'll see to each other." The words cracked through the silence like gunfire. For a heartbeat, no one moved, and then the laughter came, hard, ugly, relieved. The men at the poker table slapped their knees, cards scattering. A woman at the railing cackled and wiped tears from her painted eyes. Elias froze, fingers tightening on the glass. He had faced gun barrels and debt collectors with more calm than he felt in that moment. The giant widow's gaze did not waver, and neither did the tension twisting in his gut. "I don't recall asking for either," Elias said finally, his tone flat, but his voice lacked conviction. She set a hand on the table. The boards creaked under the weight. "No," she said. "But fate rarely waits for a man's request. I've seen your kind. You wander with nothing but ghosts for company. My ranch has enemies, my daughter has no father, and I have no patience for weak men. Decide before sundown tomorrow." The room waited, hungry for his answer, but Elias said nothing. He tipped his glass back, the last of the whiskey burning down his throat like shame. The widow studied him, then gave a single nod and turned away. The saloon's laughter dimmed to murmurs as she walked out with the same thunderous steps she had entered. Elias sat still. His pulse thudded in his ears, his pride screaming against the offer, yet a deeper voice whispering that she had seen through him in a way few ever did. Food, work, purpose, words that tasted almost sweet after so much wandering. But a husband, a father. He had buried those titles with his wife. He wasn't sure he had the strength to dig them back up. He placed the empty glass on the counter and left the saloon. The evening air carried a chill, sharper than the whiskey. The streets seemed narrower, the town's eyes sharper, as if the widow's declaration had painted a target on his back. His horse lifted its head weakly, sensing the tension. Elias untied the reins but did not mount. He stared at the horizon, where the sun sank lower, spilling red across the plains like a wound. Her words echoed, "decide before sundown tomorrow." He felt the weight of choice pressing down, heavier than any saddle he had carried. A ranch meant shelter, food, a name again. It also meant enemies, danger, and binding himself to a woman who radiated command like a marshal. His pride told him to ride out and never look back. His hunger told him to stay. His heart, long silent, whispered something stranger. Was it hope? The horse snorted, restless. Elias looked once more at the dying sun, its fire clinging to the clouds like a warning. Tomorrow would come fast. He tightened his grip on the reins, but his feet stayed planted in the dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, lonely and sharp. The town quieted with the falling night, lamps flickering alive one by one, but Elias stood unmoving, staring into the red horizon, as though it might reveal an answer he did not yet dare to speak. The dawn rode in on a brittle wind, snapping at Elias's coat as he led his horse along the narrow road out of town. He had not slept. The widow's words had followed him through the night, whispering louder than the creak of the inn's bed or the drunken voices that rose and fell beyond the window. Pride had clawed at him, urging him to ride far and fast, but hunger and something heavier had tied him to her challenge. By morning, he had convinced himself that one day on Boonland would do no harm. One day to see if the widow's talk carried more than spectacle. The ranch appeared before him like a scar across the plains, fences running jagged and barbed, cattle moving in sluggish clusters, a windmill creaking in time with the rising sun. The house itself stood tall, not elegant but strong, weathered by storms and still defiant. No flowers softened its front porch, no curtains waved from its windows. This was a fortress pretending to be a home. Clara Boone waited by the corral, arms folded, eyes steady as stone. She gave no greeting, only a curt nod, as if his arrival were expected rather than welcomed. Elias swung down from his saddle, feeling her gaze measure his worth the way a blacksmith tests iron before striking. "You can still ride away," she said, voice low, almost indifferent. Elias adjusted his hat, scanning the ranch, the herd, the lean-to where tools rested in careless order. "I'll work," he replied, though the word felt like a concession torn from his ribs. Without another word, Clara turned and led him across the yard. She walked with the certainty of someone who knew every nail hammered into this land. Elias followed, boots crunching on gravel, until they reached the barn. She pointed at the tools lined against the wall. "The fences are weak on the east pasture. You'll mend them before sundown." It was no small task. He could hear the test beneath her words, as sharp as any blade. He nodded, took the hammer and coil of wire, and set off across the fields. The day stretched hard and merciless. The sun climbed, punishing his back, his hands blistered under the wire, and the dry wind filled his mouth with grit. Yet he worked, sweat pouring into the dust, body aching with the simple, brutal rhythm of survival. As hours passed, the emptiness inside him shifted into something steadier. Every strike of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat returned. By late afternoon, he paused at the fence line, wiping his brow with a sleeve gone dark with sweat. A sharp whistle cut the air. He turned to see a girl on horseback watching him. She could not have been more than 12, yet she sat in the saddle with the certainty of a full-grown wrangler. Her dark hair tumbled free, her eyes sharp and suspicious, narrowing on him as though he were some thief trespassing on her land. "You're the new husband," she said, voice flat. Elias's chest tightened. He shook his head slowly. "I'm just a man fixing a fence." She tilted her chin, unconvinced. "Ma says you'll stay." "Your ma speaks bold," he answered, forcing a faint smile, though it faltered under her gaze. The girl circled him with her horse, studying every scar, every line of wear. "I don't like you," she declared at last. Elias almost laughed, but there was no malice in her bluntness, only a fierce guard set around her heart. "Then we're honest folk," he said. "Because I'm not sure I like me either." For a fleeting moment, her eyes softened, curiosity flickering before the shield returned. She pulled on the reins, guiding her horse back toward the house without another word. When Elias returned at dusk, his hands raw, the fence mended, Clara stood waiting. The girl lingered behind her, silent but watchful. Clara inspected the work, then looked at him with something that might have been approval. "You'll eat," she said, and gestured toward the house. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and stew. The table was broad, built for a family long gone. Only 3 bowls waited. Clara served without ceremony, filling each dish with meat and potatoes boiled plain. Elias ate slowly, savoring every bite as though it might vanish if he hurried. Across from him, the girl's eyes never left his hands, her suspicion as sharp as any blade. "Mary," Clara said, breaking the silence. "This is Elias Carter. He'll be working here a while." The girl, Mary, did not nod, only pressed her lips together and continued watching him. Elias lowered his spoon, feeling the weight of her judgment heavier than any tool he had carried that day. Clara's gaze cut through the moment. "This ranch has enemies," she said. "Men who would see it broken and burned. My husband was killed for this land. I intend to keep it, but I can't do it alone. That is why you are here." Elias met her eyes. He thought of the whispers in the saloon, the laughter that had followed her bold words. He thought of his own hunger, his own loneliness, the gnawing ache of lost purpose. He had meant only to work one day, to leave with his pride intact. But the truth lay before him like a poker hand he could not fold. Walking away meant returning to nothing. Staying meant risk, perhaps death. But it also meant belonging to something larger than his grief. The firelight caught Clara's face, casting her jaw in shadow, her eyes in steel. "You will decide soon enough," she said. Outside, a sudden commotion broke the stillness. Hooves thundered, dogs barked, cattle lowed in panic. Clara was on her feet in an instant, Mary close behind. Elias followed, hand at his revolver, though his body still ached from the day's toil. 3 riders tore past the outer fence, masks drawn across their faces, rifles gleaming in the fading light. They fired shots into the air, whooping as the cattle scattered. One turned his gun toward the house, bullets sparking off the porch rail. Elias drew, the motion instinctive, the sound of the shot echoing through the valley. One rider toppled from his saddle, hitting the dust hard. The other 2 wheeled their horses, retreating into the open plains, curses trailing behind them. The dogs quieted. The cattle slowed their frenzy. Smoke drifted from the muzzle of Elias's revolver. Clara looked at him, expression unreadable, but her eyes lingered on him longer than they had all day. Mary's stare was different now, sharpened not by suspicion but by something closer to awe. Elias lowered the gun, chest heaving, ears ringing with the aftermath of violence. The night settled heavy around them, filled with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Clara spoke at last, her voice low, steady, carrying more weight than any bullet fired. "Now you see," she said. "This is Boone land. This is what it means to stay." The words carved themselves into him as surely as the hammer had carved wire into wood. He glanced at Mary, then back to the widow, and for the first time since he had buried his wife, Elias Carter felt the stir of something like purpose clawing its way back into his heart. The weeks that followed pressed Elias into the marrow of Boone land. The work was endless, mending fences, driving cattle, stacking hay until his shoulders screamed. Yet each task carried a quiet rhythm that stitched him back into the living world. He rose with the sun, labored until his body faltered, and slept under a roof that belonged to someone other than himself. In that cycle of exhaustion, something long dormant began to stir. Mary shadowed him everywhere. At first she watched with arms crossed, face drawn into a scowl that dared him to falter. When he dropped a post in the dirt or missed a nail with the hammer, she smirked with satisfaction. But little by little, her sharpness dulled into curiosity. She asked questions, not kindly, but steadily. "Why do you wrap the rope that way? How do you calm a horse that won't be saddled? What happens if the gun jams?" Elias answered with patience he had not known he carried. He showed her how to hold the reins low to keep a skittish mare steady, how to clean a rifle with care, how to track coyotes by the scatter of paw prints near the chicken coops. She absorbed every lesson with a hunger that reminded him of his own youth, when knowledge meant survival. One afternoon, as he adjusted the sights on her small rifle, she whispered the word "Pa" without meaning to. It startled them both. Her cheeks flushed, her mouth snapped shut, but Elias heard it, and the sound rattled in his chest long after. Clara noticed the shift. She said little, but her eyes followed them with a wary awareness. She worked as hard as any man, her hands rough from years of toil, yet her presence carried the weight of command. She did not praise Elias, nor did she scold, but when he returned from a task, she always seemed to know whether it had been done well. He began to sense in her something beyond steel, a grief carved into shape, hardened by necessity. One evening, after the herd was corralled and the night insects sang, Elias found Clara by the fire. The flames threw her face into sharp relief, half shadow, half glow. She was silent for a long time, staring into the embers. At last she spoke, her voice stripped of the iron she carried in daylight. "My husband was not the man they said he was," she murmured. "The town called him strong, but strength isn't cruelty. He took this land with blood, and he ruled it with fear. I stayed because weakness would have killed me." Her eyes shifted to Elias, hard again, but shining with something unguarded. "Do you understand now why I cannot let Mary grow soft? This world eats softness." Elias listened, the crack of the fire filling the silence that followed. He saw, for the first time, not just the widow who had declared her claim on him, but the woman who had carried the weight of survival alone. He wanted to speak, to tell her that strength could also be gentleness, but the words tangled. Instead, he said, You've kept her alive. That's more than most can claim." The admission hung between them, unpolished but true. Clara turned back to the fire, her jaw tight, as though afraid softness might betray her. A week later, the town proved her caution right. Elias had ridden in with a small drove of cattle to sell. The streets smelled of manure and dust, the usual chorus of merchants and drunkards filling the air. Inside the saloon, he struck his bargain with the cattle buyer, coins heavy in his hand. But as he turned to leave, voices cut through the clamor, two men by the bar, speaking low, unaware of his ear. "Banks ready to foreclose. Widow won't stand long. Got outlaws waiting by the ridge, paid to drive her clean off Boone land." Elias stiffened. One of the men noticed him, smirking. "Look here," the fellow sneered. "That's the new dog she's taken in." The other spat tobacco onto the floor. "Let him fetch and heal while he can. Won't matter when Boone land burns." Their laughter turned sharp, goading. Elias's hand hovered at his revolver, but he forced it away. Violence here would spill back on Clara. He moved for the door, jaw clenched. "Run along, ranch dog," one called after him. The words bit, but Elias kept walking, until the echo of chairs scraping broke his restraint. They came at him quick, pistols half-drawn. He spun, firing before thought could catch up. The first man fell hard, blood streaking across the boards. The second fired back, shot tearing the brim of Elias's hat. Elias ducked, fired again, and the man collapsed against the bar. The saloon erupted in chaos, shouts, overturned tables, boots pounding toward the exits. Elias shoved through the bodies, heart hammering, smoke thick in his throat. He burst into the street, leapt onto his horse, and galloped hard for Boone land, the sound of pursuit snapping at his heels until the town shouts faded behind him. By the time he reached the ranch, his breath was raw, his shirt streaked with sweat and dust. Clara met him in the yard, Mary at her side. Her eyes scanned him, reading the truth in his expression before he could speak. "They're coming," he said. Her jaw set. They always were. That night, unease settled like smoke over the ranch. Elias patrolled the grounds, rifle slung across his back, every shadow a possible enemy. But unease hardened into terror when dawn revealed its first wound, a ranch hand sprawled near the barn, throat cut clean. His eyes stared at the sky as though searching for an answer he never found. Mary gasped, clinging to Clara's side. Elias crouched, scanning the dirt. No tracks but the killer's, no sign of struggle. His stomach knotted when he noticed the wood plank nailed to the barn door. Words carved deep, ragged but deliberate, *** Boone blood must end. ***. Clara read them without flinching, though her fingers trembled before she forced them still. She turned to Elias, her voice as hard as iron striking stone. "Now you see why I chose you." The morning air was brittle with silence. Elias stared at the words, at the corpse cooling in the dust, and felt the weight of Clara's declaration settle heavier on him than ever before. Boone land was no longer just her fight, it was his. And from this moment on, there would be no turning back. The body was buried at sunrise, a shallow grave dug into hard earth behind the barn. Clara said no words over it, only pressed her hand once into the soil before rising, her face set like iron. Mary lingered, eyes hollow, until Elias touched her shoulder and guided her away. The message carved into the barn door remained, a scar on the wood that no amount of scraping could erase. It glared at them each time they passed, a reminder that the enemy was no longer whispering threats but writing them in blood. From that morning forward, Boone land braced for war. Elias rode the fences with a rifle across his saddle, scanning the ridges for silhouettes. Clara doubled the dogs at night, their howls breaking the silence whenever shadows stirred beyond the corral. Mary, restless and stubborn, refused to be kept inside. She followed Elias through the fields, practicing with her rifle until her aim no longer trembled. When he scolded her, she answered only with a glare that mirrored her mother's. In that fierce defiance, Elias saw both the danger of her world and the strength it had carved into her. The widow trusted no one beyond their gates. When Elias asked about neighbors, she shook her head. "Every hand that shakes yours may hide a knife," she said. Her suspicions seemed carved from experience, and Elias did not press her further. Instead, he set his mind to preparation. Barrels of water were hauled to the house. Ammunition was cleaned and counted. Windows were shuttered with planks thick enough to catch a bullet. By the third night, Boone Ranch looked less like a home and more like a fortress waiting to be tested. It came with the storm. The sky blackened with rolling clouds, lightning slicing the horizon. Wind screamed across the plains, rattling every loose board and shutter. Amid the chaos of weather came the sound Elias had feared, hooves, dozens of them, pounding through the night like drums of war. He and Clara exchanged a single glance, no surprise, only grim certainty, before rushing to their posts. Mary scrambled to the roof with her rifle, the storm soaking her hair, her eyes alight with a fire too old for her years. The riders came hard and fast, masks pulled tight, rifles raised. Their whoops cut through the thunder, wild and merciless. Gunfire cracked, splinters flew from the barn, cattle screamed in panic. Elias fired from the porch, each shot deliberate, each breath steady despite the storm and his racing heart. He dropped one man from his horse, then another, the bodies vanishing into the mud. Clara fought like she was born of the tempest, standing tall in the yard with her shotgun booming, each blast echoing through the storm like thunder made flesh. Mary's shots whistled from above, precise and sharp. Elias spared a glance upward and saw her small frame silhouetted against lightning, the rifle steady in her hands. A surge of pride pierced through the terror. She was not breaking, she was rising. But the attackers pressed harder, circling, firing, their numbers greater than Elias had feared. A bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him backward against the porch rail. Pain flared hot, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, firing again with his left hand. Clara reached him, blood streaking her arm, but her eyes burned fierce. She pressed a hand to his wound, quick and firm, then shoved him back into the fight. The storm swallowed time. Minutes stretched into an eternity of thunder, fire, and blood. The barn caught flame, orange tongues clawing toward the sky. Smoke stung their throats, mixing with rain until the yard became a battlefield of mud and fire. Still the widow fought, still Elias stood, still Mary's rifle cracked from above. At last, the tide broke. The remaining riders faltered, retreating into the storm's veil. Their curses faded with the thunder, leaving only the roar of rain and the crackle of the burning barn. Elias staggered, his body screaming, but the sight of the fleeing silhouettes filled him with a savage relief. Boone Land still stood. When silence finally fell, broken only by the hiss of rain on fire, Clara lowered her shotgun. Her chest heaved, her hair clung to her face, but her eyes locked on Elias with a heat he had never seen before. She stepped close, steadying him as his knees threatened to buckle. "You came here a broken man," she said, her voice ragged but unwavering. "But tonight you stood like Boone." Elias swallowed hard, the words striking deeper than any bullet. He looked up toward the roof, where Mary climbed down, soaked to the bone but alive, her rifle clutched tight. She ran to him, and without hesitation, wrapped her arms around his waist. The word she had once slipped now came with certainty, "Pa." The sound of it shattered the last of his resistance. He bent, despite the pain, and held her tight, the storm washing away the ashes of his old life. For the first time since burying his wife, Elias Carter did not feel hollow. He felt bound, to the widow, to the girl, to the land that demanded blood for belonging. Dawn crawled slow and heavy across the plains, revealing the wreckage. The barn was gone, reduced to blackened ribs of timber. The yard was littered with the remnants of violence, shell casings, hoofprints churned deep in mud, blood darkening the soil. Yet the house still stood. The fences still rose. Boone Land breathed, scarred but unbroken. Elias sat on the porch, shoulder bandaged, watching the horizon as the storm clouds drifted away. Clara stood beside him, silent, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Mary slept against his side, her head tucked beneath his chin, rifle resting across her lap. The narrator's voice seemed to stir from the wind itself, solemn and steady. In the Wild West, families were not born, they were forged, hammered into being by fire and loss, by storms weathered and battles survived. Boone Land had demanded blood, and it had been paid. Elias lifted his eyes to the horizon, where the first pale light touched the ridges. For the first time in years, he did not dread what lay beyond it. He had something worth fighting for, worth staying for. And to those listening, the voice turned outward, carrying through time like an old campfire tale. If this story of love, loss, and redemption moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Out here, every story is worth remembering.